On May 1st, 1707, a historic political change took place in the British Isles. Through the Acts of Union, the kingdoms of Scotland and England officially united to form a single state known as Great Britain. For Scotland, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where its identity became intertwined with a larger political union. Yet Scotland's story did not begin in the 18th century. In reality, the roots of this proud nation stretched thousands of years into the past. Long before parliaments and treaties, Scotland was a land shaped by ancient peoples, powerful tribes, dramatic landscapes, and remarkable resilience. To understand Scotland today, we must first travel far back into a distant past filled with mystery and transformation. Scotland sits at the northern edge of the British Isles, surrounded by powerful seas that helped shape its history. To the south lies England, while the North Sea borders the east. The Atlantic Ocean stretches along the west, and the Irish Sea touches the southwest. This strategic position made Scotland both a gateway for trade and a battlefield for competing powers throughout history. But Scotland is far from a uniform land. Its geography is incredibly diverse. The southern uplands are filled with fertile farmland and rolling hills that form a natural boundary with England. Moving northward, the central lowlands emerge as the heart of Scotland. This region would later become the most populated part of the country, home to major cities such as Edinburgh and Glasgow. Beyond the lowlands lies a completely different world, the highlands and islands. Here, the landscape becomes rugged and dramatic, filled with towering mountains, deep valleys, and countless lochs. Even today, this region captures the wild beauty that Scotland is famous for. But Scotland was not always the green and dramatic land we see today. Millions of years ago, the region was buried under massive glaciers during the Ice Age. Thick sheets of ice covered the land, creating a frozen wilderness where almost no life could survive. Over thousands of years, however, the climate gradually warmed. The ice began to melt, rivers formed, and forests slowly returned. It was during this transformation that the first humans arrived. Around 9,600 BC, small groups of hunter-gatherers began entering Scotland as the glaciers retreated. These early settlers were Mesolithic people who likely traveled north from mainland Europe, following migrating animals and searching for new land. Their lives were incredibly difficult. The environment was harsh and resources were limited. These early inhabitants survived by hunting deer, fishing in rivers and lochs, and gathering wild plants. They crafted tools from stone and built simple shelters using wood, bones, and animal skins. Constant movement was essential for survival, so these early communities rarely stayed in one place for long. Yet despite these challenges, they adapted remarkably well. Over the next 1,000 years, Scotland's climate continued to improve. Forests spread across the land, wildlife became more abundant, and rivers flowed more steadily. As conditions stabilized, human life in Scotland began to change. The hunter-gatherers slowly transitioned into a more settled lifestyle. This new period, known as the Neolithic Age, introduced farming, animal herding, and permanent settlements. People began cultivating crops, raising livestock, and building stone structures that would last for centuries. One of the most astonishing examples of this early civilization is the ancient village of Skara Brae, located on the Orkney Islands. Dating back over 5,000 years, Skara Brae is actually older than the pyramids of Egypt. The people who built it demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Their homes were constructed from stone and connected by narrow passageways. Inside these houses, archaeologists discovered stone furniture, beds, shelves, and cupboards carefully carved from rock. These early inhabitants had created one of the best preserved prehistoric villages ever discovered. But Skara Brae was only part of a larger cultural transformation. Across the Scottish landscape, Neolithic people built mysterious monuments that still puzzle historians today. Massive standing stones, burial chambers, and ceremonial sites appeared throughout the region. Structures like the standing stones of Callanish suggest that these ancient communities possess complex spiritual beliefs and sophisticated social organization. However, this era of stability would not last forever. By around 2000 BC, Scotland entered the Bronze Age, bringing dramatic changes to society. For the first time, metal tools and weapons began replacing stone. Communities grew larger and more connected, and trade networks expanded across the British Isles and beyond. Materials such as copper and tin became valuable resources, allowing bronze to be produced. These metals were traded between regions, creating new wealth and strengthening relationships between different communities. But as Scotland grew more connected to the outside world, new powers began to emerge within its borders. One of the most mysterious of these groups was known as the Picts. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the Picts had become one of the dominant peoples of northern Scotland. Though historians still debate their exact origins, they were first described by the Romans, who called them Picti, meaning the painted ones. This name likely came from their tradition of decorating their bodies with tattoos or painted symbols. Yet the Picts were far more than warriors with striking appearances. They formed powerful tribal kingdoms, built fortified settlements, and developed a society that was both agricultural and artistic. They farmed crops like oats, raised livestock, and hunted in Scotland's forests. At the same time, they carved intricate symbols into large standing stones, artworks that remain one of the most intriguing legacies of early Scottish history. As the Picts expanded their influence across the north, Scotland began to evolve into a land of competing tribes and emerging kingdoms. But another powerful force was rising in the south. An empire unlike any the world had ever seen was beginning to look northward, toward the rugged land the Romans called Caledonia. And soon Scotland would face one of the greatest challenges in its early history. By the 1st century AD, a powerful empire had begun expanding across Europe. The Roman Empire had already conquered vast territories, and in 43 AD it successfully invaded southern Britain. Roman legions quickly established control over much of the island, building roads, forts, and cities that reflected the might of their civilization. But beyond the northern frontier lay a land that refused to submit. The Romans called this mysterious region Caledonia, a rugged territory filled with dense forests, steep hills, and fiercely independent tribes. To Roman leaders, Caledonia represented both opportunity and challenge. The land was rich in timber, metals, and fertile soil. If conquered, it could strengthen Rome's position in Britain and demonstrate the empire's unstoppable power. However, conquering Scotland would prove far more difficult than the Romans expected. In 79 AD, the Roman governor of Britain, General Gnaeus Julius Agricola, launched a major campaign into Caledonia. Agricola was an experienced military commander who understood that success required careful preparation. Before advancing, he sent scouts deep into northern territory to gather intelligence about the tribes and terrain. Armed with this knowledge, Agricola began building a network of forts along important routes to secure Roman supply lines. These defensive structures allowed Roman forces to move deeper into Scotland while maintaining control of the territory behind them. But the Caledonian tribes were not easy opponents. Unlike the organized armies of Rome, the tribes of Scotland fought using mobility and local knowledge. They knew every hill, forest, and valley of their homeland. Instead of fighting large open battles, they often launched sudden ambushes before disappearing back into the wilderness. For the Romans, it was a frustrating and unfamiliar style of warfare. Eventually, the two forces met in one of the most famous battles of ancient Scottish history, the Battle of Mons Graupius, fought around 83 AD. The Caledonian army was reportedly massive, possibly numbering more than 30,000 warriors. In comparison, Agricola's Roman forces were much smaller, with around 15,000 soldiers. Despite being outnumbered, the Romans relied on disciplined formations, superior equipment, and battlefield tactics. After a brutal fight, the Romans claimed victory. Yet their triumph was far from complete. Even after the battle, the Caledonian tribes refused to surrender. Their decentralized leadership made it difficult for the Romans to fully control the region. Without a single king to negotiate with, resistance continued across the northern lands. Roman commanders soon realized that conquering all of Scotland might not be worth the enormous cost. Instead, they adopted a new strategy: containment. Rather than pushing further north, the Romans decided to secure the territory they already controlled. To achieve this, they constructed one of the most famous defensive structures in European history, Hadrian's Wall. Built beginning in 122 AD under Emperor Hadrian, the wall stretched approximately 73 miles across northern Britain. It ran from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. Along its length stood forts, watchtowers, and gates that allowed Roman soldiers to monitor movement across the frontier. Hadrian's Wall marked the boundary between the Roman world and the wild lands of Caledonia. However, Roman ambitions did not completely fade. Just 20 years later, another emperor attempted to push the frontier north once again. In 142 AD, Emperor Antoninus Pius ordered the construction of a second defensive barrier, the Antonine Wall. This wall stretched about 37 miles between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. But unlike Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall was built mostly from turf and earth rather than solid stone. It proved far less durable and far more difficult to defend. The northern tribes, including the powerful Picts, repeatedly attacked Roman outposts along the wall. Supply lines were constantly threatened, and maintaining the frontier became increasingly expensive. After only about 20 years, the Romans abandoned the Antonine Wall and retreated back to Hadrian's Wall. Although Roman forces remained in Britain for centuries, they never succeeded in fully conquering Scotland. For the tribes of Caledonia, this resistance became a symbol of independence and strength. Yet, as Roman power gradually declined, new groups began shaping the future of Scotland. During the 5th century, a Celtic people known as the Scots began migrating from Northern Ireland. These settlers came from a kingdom called Dal Riata, located in what is now County Antrim. Crossing the narrow channel of sea, they established new communities along the western coast of Scotland, particularly in modern-day Argyll and the Inner Hebrides. At first, the arrival of the Scots created tension with the existing Pictish kingdoms. Battles and rivalries were common as both groups competed for land and influence. But the Scots also brought something that would change Scotland forever. They brought Christianity. In 563 AD, an Irish monk named Saint Columba traveled to Scotland with a group of followers. Columba founded a monastery on the small island of Iona, which soon became one of the most important religious centers in the region. From this base, missionaries traveled across Scotland, spreading the Christian faith. Churches and monasteries appeared throughout the land, gradually replacing older pagan traditions. Christianity also played an unexpected political role. It created connections between rival tribes and kingdoms, encouraging cooperation and shared beliefs. Over time, religion helped unify communities that had once been divided by conflict. But Scotland was still far from a single nation. Instead, the land remained a patchwork of competing kingdoms, including the Picts in the north and east, the Scots in the west, and Brittonic kingdoms in the south. And soon, an entirely new threat would arrive from across the sea, warriors whose raids would shake the entire region. The Vikings were coming. By the late 8th century, a new and terrifying force began appearing along the coasts of Britain. These warriors came from Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They were known as the Vikings, and their arrival would transform the history of Scotland. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were skilled sailors and fearless explorers. Their longships allowed them to travel vast distances across the seas with incredible speed. When they attacked, they struck quickly and without warning, often targeting coastal villages and monasteries where defenses were weak. One of the earliest recorded Viking attacks in Scotland occurred in 795 AD when raiders struck several islands along the western coast. But one of the most devastating attacks came a few years later. In 802 AD, Viking forces attacked the monastery of Iona, one of the most important religious centers in Scotland. Monks were killed, treasures were stolen, and the peaceful community that St. Columba had founded centuries earlier was left in ruins. Similar raids followed across the region, spreading fear among both the Scots and the Picts. At first, these attacks were temporary raids. But by the mid-9th century, the Vikings began settling permanently in several parts of Scotland. They established strongholds in the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, and the Hebrides, turning these locations into powerful bases for further expansion. The Norse settlers brought their own language, culture, and traditions. Over time, their influence blended with local Gaelic culture, creating a unique mixture that can still be seen in place names and traditions today. As Viking power grew, Scotland faced a serious problem. The land was still divided between rival kingdoms, the Picts in the north and east, the Scots in the west, and other smaller groups scattered throughout the region. Divided, they were far more vulnerable to outside threats. It was during this dangerous time that one of the most important figures in Scottish history emerged. His name was Kenneth MacAlpin. Kenneth was the king of the Scots of Dalriada, but he also had connections to the Pictish royal family. This unusual heritage placed him in a unique position between the two cultures. In 843 AD, Kenneth succeeded in uniting the kingdoms of the Scots and the Picts under a single crown. This new kingdom became known as Alba, which is considered the early foundation of the Scottish nation. Although historians still debate exactly how this union happened, what is clear is that Kenneth's rule marked a turning point. For the first time, much of Scotland was governed under a single monarch. This unity was essential. With Viking raids continuing across the coasts, a stronger and more coordinated kingdom was necessary for survival. Kenneth and his successors worked to strengthen alliances, promote shared culture, and spread the Gaelic language across their territories. Over the following centuries, the Kingdom of Alba slowly evolved into what we now recognize as Scotland. Meanwhile, Viking influence remained strong in the northern and western islands. Norse rulers controlled these regions for generations, and their presence continued to shape Scotland's culture and politics. Eventually, however, the balance of power began to shift. By the 13th century, Scottish kings sought to reclaim territories still controlled by Norse rulers. One of the most important moments came in 1263 during the Battle of Largs. At the time, King Alexander III of Scotland wanted to bring the Western Islands fully under Scottish control. When negotiations with Norway failed, the Norwegian King Haakon IV launched a massive fleet toward Scotland. But the invasion did not go as planned. A powerful storm scattered many Norwegian ships along the coast near Largs. Seeing an opportunity, Scottish forces attacked the stranded invaders. Although the battle itself was not enormous, it marked a turning point. Within a few years, Norway agreed to give up control of the Hebrides and other territories through the Treaty of Perth in 1266. This treaty effectively ended centuries of Viking influence over much of Scotland. With this victory, Scotland seemed stronger than ever. But another crisis soon emerged. In 1286, King Alexander III died unexpectedly after falling from his horse. His death left Scotland without a clear adult heir to the throne. His granddaughter, Margaret, the young maid of Norway, was supposed to become queen, but she died on her journey to Scotland in 1290. Suddenly, the kingdom faced a dangerous power vacuum. More than a dozen noble families claimed the Scottish throne. Fearing civil war, Scottish leaders made a fateful decision. They asked King Edward I of England to help choose the next king. Edward agreed, but only on the condition that Scotland recognize him as its overlord. Under Edward's influence, John Balliol was chosen as the new King of Scotland in 1292. However, Edward treated Balliol more like a servant than a king, repeatedly interfering in Scottish affairs. Scottish anger quickly grew. By 1296, war broke out between Scotland and England. Edward I invaded Scotland, defeated Scottish forces, and forced King Balliol to surrender. Scotland was effectively placed under English control, but the Scottish people refused to accept this defeat. From among the common people, a new leader emerged, William Wallace. Wallace organized a resistance movement against English rule. In 1297, he led Scottish forces to a remarkable victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Using clever tactics, Wallace's army trapped English troops on a narrow bridge and defeated them despite being outnumbered. For a brief moment, Scotland regained hope. However, the struggle was far from over. In 1298, Edward I returned with a powerful army and defeated Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace eventually went into hiding, but in 1305 he was captured and executed by the English. Once again, Scotland seemed to be on the brink of losing its freedom. But another leader was about to rise, one who would change Scotland's destiny forever. His name was Robert the Bruce. After the death of William Wallace, Scotland's struggle for independence seemed almost hopeless. England controlled much of the country, and many Scottish nobles were divided about what to do next. But one man was determined to change Scotland's fate. His name was Robert the Bruce. Bruce came from a powerful noble family and had long been a rival for the Scottish throne. In 1306, he made a bold and controversial move that shocked the kingdom. During a confrontation inside a church in Dumfries, Bruce killed his rival John Comyn, another powerful claimant to the throne. Only weeks later, Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scotland. However, his early reign was far from secure. England's King Edward I immediately launched a campaign against him. Bruce was defeated in several early battles and forced to flee into hiding. For a time, it seemed as though his rebellion might collapse entirely. But fortune soon began to shift. When Edward I died in 1307, Bruce slowly began rebuilding support across Scotland. Using guerrilla tactics and carefully planned attacks, he started reclaiming castles and territories from English control. Then came the moment that would define Scottish history. In 1314, English King Edward II marched north with a massive army to crush the Scottish rebellion once and for all. His forces greatly outnumbered those of Robert the Bruce. The two armies met near Stirling Castle at the Battle of Bannockburn. Bruce understood that the terrain could work in his favor. The battlefield contained marshy ground and narrow approaches that limited the movement of English cavalry. Scottish soldiers formed tight defensive formations known as schiltrons, using long spears to create walls of protection against mounted attacks. As the English army advanced, the difficult terrain disrupted their movements. Scottish forces held their ground and gradually pushed the enemy back. By the end of the battle, the English army was in chaos. Thousands of English soldiers were killed or captured, and King Edward II himself barely escaped. Bannockburn became one of the greatest victories in Scottish history. But the struggle for recognition continued. In 1320, Scottish nobles issued a powerful document known as the Declaration of Arbroath. Sent to the Pope, the declaration argued that Scotland had always been an independent kingdom and that its people would never willingly accept English rule. The document famously declared that as long as even 100 Scots remained alive, they would never surrender their freedom. Finally, in 1328, England officially recognized Scotland's independence through the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. For a time, Scotland enjoyed peace and stability. However, political challenges continued over the following centuries. After the death of King David II, the Scottish throne passed to the Stuart dynasty, beginning with Robert II in 1371. The Stuarts ruled Scotland for generations and oversaw a period of cultural development and growing royal authority. Yet the monarchy also faced internal struggles and conflicts with neighboring England. One of the most dramatic figures of this era was Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary became queen when she was only 6 days old after the death of her father in 1542. Raised in France for her safety, she grew up surrounded by French culture and politics. When she eventually returned to Scotland as an adult, she found a country deeply divided by religion. The Protestant Reformation had transformed Scottish society, and many powerful leaders opposed Mary's Catholic faith. Political tensions grew worse after a series of scandals and controversial marriages. Eventually, Scottish nobles forced Mary to abdicate the throne in 1567, placing her infant son on the throne as James VI. Mary fled to England seeking protection from her cousin Queen Elizabeth I. Instead, she was imprisoned for nearly 20 years before being executed in 1587 for allegedly plotting against Elizabeth. Ironically, Mary's son would go on to unite the crowns of both kingdoms. When Elizabeth I died without children in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, creating what became known as the Union of the Crowns. For the first time, both kingdoms shared the same monarch. However, Scotland and England still remained separate nations with their own parliaments, laws, and institutions. It would take another century before a full political union occurred. In the late 1600s, Scotland faced severe economic problems, worsened by the failure of the Darien scheme, an ambitious but disastrous attempt to establish a Scottish colony in Panama. The financial collapse left Scotland struggling, and political negotiations with England eventually led to the Acts of Union in Tuxtos Septini Simti Septitais. These acts dissolved the Scottish Parliament and created the Kingdom of Great Britain, uniting Scotland and England under a single parliament in London. Many Scots opposed the union, believing their nation had been forced into it. Protests broke out in several cities, and debates about independence continued for centuries. Despite these tensions, Scotland played a major role in shaping the modern world. During the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, thinkers such as David Hume and Adam Smith revolutionized philosophy and economics. Scotland also became a center for scientific discovery, education, and innovation. Later, during the Industrial Revolution, Scottish cities like Glasgow grew into major centers of engineering, shipbuilding, and manufacturing. In the modern era, Scotland has continued to balance its rich history with its place within the United Kingdom. In 1999, Scotland regained its own parliament in Edinburgh, restoring a form of self-government after nearly 300 years. And in 2014, Scotland held a historic referendum asking whether it should become an independent country once again. The result was close. About 55% voted to remain in the United Kingdom, while 45% supported independence. Today, Scotland remains a land deeply proud of its past. From ancient stone villages and Viking legends to modern cities and political debates, its story continues to evolve. And the question that has echoed through centuries of history still remains. Will Scotland one day become fully independent again? Only time will tell.